start recording. Sometimes it freaks out on me when I record. So today we have Mandy and Trevor live from our office. It's lovely. It's kind of dark, but it makes for better lighting. So, yay for history. All right. So we already did the icebreaker. Bananas. It's all a conspiracy, you guys. Bananas are a conspiracy. So when we were studying the Bible in spring, we were studying the early church, the very early church. Like Jesus had just died. And then Peter, and the other apostles were spreading the message. Then Paul got involved and different churches were being planted all over the Mediterranean. Mostly in the Israel, Turkey, Greece area, but obviously there was a Roman church. And then we talked about how later Paul possibly even went as far as Spain. But the church grew and it expanded. So you may ask yourself, how did we get from this early church where everyone looked to the apostles as the authorities, right? And when they had disputes, they took it back to them through letters if they could. And that's why we have these letters that make up the New Testament. How did we get from this to what we are today? Which is what? There are like over 1,000 denominations?
Yeah, something like that.
It's something like that. So now we have where there used to be just like these individual churches that when they had beliefs that kind of varied, the apostles would send the smack down via letter and be like, you guys are wrong for this, and this reason. Come back to the fold. Like Corinthians, right? If you read the letter to the Corinthians were completely off the rails. And Paul wrote that letter because he was like, you guys are so wrong. And let me put it in like 14 chapters, 15 chapters. It's a lot of chapters. Corinthians is a long book. So how did we get from that to being here where, as we talked about when we talked about translating the Bible and what is the Bible, we get all these controversies. Nobody agrees on anything. We have a million denominations. If you disagree on whether baptism should be by sprinkling or immersion, now you're in a new denomination, right? How did that happen? How did we get here? What is the history that has brought us here? So today we're going to talk about that history. Next week, we're going to talk more about the denominations and what they actually believe. But for today, we're just going to kind of talk about the history of how all these different groups became different groups, if you will. But we're not going to talk about all 1,000 denominations because ain't nobody got time for that. So we're just going to look at some of the major splits. I just lost my train of thought. So yes, that's what we're talking about today. So originally, everybody was just a Christian, right? There were no denominations. And that continued that way for a very, very long time. In fact, there was only one denomination till about, give or take. There were the Anabaptists. We're not counting them. So there was like one denomination, give or take, until about 1,000 AD. So you had the early church, like we studied about in Acts. From these people, you had, the apostles, who everyone was completely acknowledged they were the leaders. But then the apostles die. And then you have new people who come in, new leaders. And things grow from there. You had Nero, who was like persecuting the church in Rome. But eventually things changed around 300 AD. And that is when Constantine?
Yes.
Became emperor of Rome. And as the story goes, Constantine was in a battle. And in his battle, he prayed to God and said, if you help us with this battle, I will become a Christian. And the Romans won. I think he possibly saw a wheel in the sky or a cross. There's some story like this that we don't know if it's true. It's kind of mythologized at this point. He after that, he was like, I, the emperor of Rome, am a Christian. And because of this, he was like, now all of Rome has to be a Christian with me.
Yes.
Because they didn't believe in freedom of religion back then. They were like, well, I'm the emperor. I say this is what it is. So this is what it is. Welcome, everybody, to our new Christian empire. I know last week we were pagans who believed in Zeus, but this week we believe in God. we've kind of talked about before that this was actually a really hard transition for a lot of people, right? And this is why Christmas is on December 25th. It's not because Jesus was born on December 25th. It's because Saturnalia was on December 25th. That is when they had this huge Roman festival, and it was really a lot of fun. And so the emperor wanted people to stop celebrating Saturnalia and celebrate Jesus instead. So that's how we got Christmas on December 25th. There's a dog right here. And so with this, more people became Christians. Let me see. Mike says he searched it, and it says Constantine saw a cross in the sky. Constantine was a pagan monotheist, a devotee of the sun god Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. However, before the Milvian Bridge battle, he and his army saw a cross of light in the sky above the sun with the words in Greek that are generally translated into Latin as in hoc signo vinces. In this sign, conquer. I guess it would be vinces, not Vincus, because it's an ES. That's right. I took 4 years of Latin. So yes, he saw a cross in the sky and became a Christian. So now you have even more people who are Christians. And if the Romans believed in one thing, it is order. It is that everyone has a rank, everyone has a place, and there must be order. That kind of came to the church. And it's not that the church didn't have pastors and bishops and leaders before. It's that the Romans were like very regimental about it. And this is kind of the origins of the Roman Catholic Church as we know it today. Hence the name Roman Catholic. So the Catholic Church during this, well, they weren't called the Catholic Church then. That's the first thing. The Catholic just means universal. So the universal church, the church that everybody was a part of, right? With the Rome now accepting them, they could actually look hard at what they believed and do things like create the Bible. That's the wrong word. They didn't create the Bible. Assemble the Bible. So before this, there was, people had letters. They had individual letters. They might have an assembled version of the Old Testament. But then we had a couple of councils, because now that the Christians could meet in open, these different Christian leaders could meet and make decisions. Codify. That's a good word, Mike. They codified the Bible. So they could look at the different writings people had been circulating and say, this one is good, this one is not good. And kind of the test they used to see if things should go into the Old Testament. The New Testament. The Old Testament was already codified. Mostly. The thing they used to determine if things should be in the New Testament was generally, was this written by somebody that is an apostle? And that was kind of the test they used. Can this be legitimately tracked back to Peter, James, any of those guys? And then they accepted Paul. Paul was an apostle. He just wasn't one of the 12 disciples, right? So the only book of the New Testament that doesn't meet that test is, as we've already talked about, Hebrews. Nobody knows.
We don't know.
We don't know.
They may have known and just chose not to tell anyone.
Yes. So we don't know who wrote Hebrews. So we don't know what kind of discussions went into them determining whether Hebrews should be in there. But I'm glad they included Hebrews, because it's a very good book of the Bible. So from this point forward, the church became more formal, and they also translated the entire Bible into Latin. And that is the Latin Vulgate. And because Latin was the language of Rome, Latin became the language of the church. Now, one would think if there was going to be a division, it would be over this language issue. But no, that is not why the first church split happened. So the first church split happened in 1054 AD.
This is the first split that was actually successful. There were a lot of heresies that were put down prior to this.
Oh, yeah.
Some of which today we wouldn't even consider heresies. But the Christian church before the Great Schism had a lot of different beliefs within it. It wasn't one monolithic theology. There were acceptable differences and unacceptable differences even back then, because each area was kind of ruled by its own head bishop, and those head bishops chose to stay together.
But some heresies were considered so extreme that they'd come and basically put you down with the sword.
Yeah.
Very Roman. And I don't mean like they'd send an army in, but I mean they would like
sometimes they did
arrest you, burn you at the stake, that kind of stuff. So the Great Schism was the first successful separation. It's also called the East-West Schism because it falls directly on geographic lines. So you see we have Roman Catholic versus Eastern Orthodox here. Roman Catholic is the Western Church. Eastern Orthodox is the Eastern Church. And I'm going to tell you, there are a lot of theological reasons why they separated, but there's only one reason why these two groups separated. One real reason. Politics and power. That's it. The Eastern Orthodox Church no longer wanted to be controlled out of Rome. They didn't want to answer to the Pope. They disagreed with some of the decisions the Pope was making. The Romans were getting ticked off with the Eastern Orthodox Church that they kept challenging them, and basically it was all about power. And as we're going to see over and over again, the majority of church splits are about power, and it's kind of disturbing.
And Rome at that time had like 5,000 inhabitants. It was no longer the greatest metropolis of the world. The greatest metropolis of, at least in the West, excluding China, was in Constantinople, which is the Eastern Orthodox, hometown.
Was this when we got the two popes?
No, two popes is really about popes. There's even a time period where there were three popes. That's all medieval and early Renaissance warring.
Yeah.
Where different people were using the office of the Pope as a political leverage against their, nation-state enemies.
So the theological argument for the Great Schism had to do with who the Holy Spirit processes from, which is a weird churchy statement that I just made. So it means who sent the Holy Spirit. And the argument is, did Jesus ask God to send the Holy Spirit, or did God just send it? That's the whole argument. The whole argument. Whether Jesus asked God or God just did it. Welcome to theology, you guys. It's fun. There are a couple other things. Obviously, the Eastern Orthodox Church didn't want to be ruled by the Pope anymore. I think they have more like a council of fathers.
Patriarchs.
Patriarchs. That's the word I was looking for. So more of an oligarchy and less of a monarchy. Both of these denominations exist to this day. You guys probably have Roman Catholic friends. You may have Eastern Orthodox friends. We have a Greek Orthodox church in Albuquerque.
Yeah.
Greek festival, man. It's delicious. Go every year. Well, we don't, but we could.
Yeah, so the Eastern Orthodox Church would have been at some point Greece, which included Turkey at the time and Constantinople, but mostly doesn't anymore. Russia, Syria, modern-day Israel, Egypt, and Ethiopia. There was even a church further east in Iran and then a little one in India, but I don't know if they were actually in fellowship with the Eastern Orthodox Church or they were just too far away geographically.
So, the Eastern Orthodox Church can be broken up into subsets, and I don't think there are actually theological differences between these subsets.
They're just small.
They're just very small. I don't think they recognize themselves as separate. I think they all view themselves as part of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and their highest patriarchs talk to the other highest patriarchs. The biggest difference between the Orthodox branches is cultural. So as Trevor was describing all these different places that are Eastern Orthodox, today the three biggest, I'm going to use the word denominations. I don't think that's quite the proper word in the Eastern Orthodox context, but the three biggest groups are Coptic Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and Russian Orthodox. Coptic Orthodox is basically Egyptian Orthodox. So it's going to be your Arabic, Africa kind of Orthodox. Greek Orthodox is Greece. I think Turkey is still Greek Orthodox if you're
still a Christian there, and a little bit further north too, around the Black Sea and that area is still going to be If you're Christian, it's probably Greek Orthodox.
Russian Orthodox is obviously the Russian church, and I'm just going to state it is a miracle the Russian Orthodox Church persists. Because, for those of you who have studied world history, you may know about the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union really tried to kill the Russian Orthodox Church. They tried very hard. The Soviet Union wanted to be a irreligious, atheist organization. They didn't want you to have a loyalty that was higher than the state. So they stole things from the church. They arrested people involved with the church. They killed people involved with the church. But the Russian Orthodox Church has persisted and exists. And it's kind of a modern miracle, actually. So I have known both someone who was raised Coptic Orthodox and someone who's Greek Orthodox. I've known way more Greek Orthodoxes. Orthodoxes? That doesn't seem right. Greek Orthodox is probably the most popular of the Orthodox in America, just because there's so many Greek people in America. And very few cities the size of Albuquerque don't have a Greek Orthodox church. So my friend who's Coptic Orthodox, he's Egyptian. So that makes complete sense. Now he's actually Baptist, but his family is still Coptic Orthodox. So I don't know the history of how these groups split. I really think it's cultural. I really think the Eastern Orthodox Church was willing to let the different cultures kind of influence their traditions and didn't have a problem with that. And so I think they kind of all view themselves still as like brothers in arms. Maybe not in arms. They brothers in faith.
They would hold religious services in languages other than Latin.
Yes.
Which the Catholic Church continued holding much of its religious service in Latin until like 1970.
Yes. So if your grandparents were Catholic, they probably went to church in Latin.
At least part of the Mass was still in Latin.
Yeah. Which gets us to, how did we come about? The Protestants. So, welcome to the next slide. The Protestant Reformation. If you ever study European history or world history, this will be something you study. So the start of the Protestant Reformation is usually the blame is usually laid at the foot of Martin Luther. Yes, Hannah, correct.
Not Martin Luther King Jr. No. Martin Luther.
Who Martin Luther King was named after, but Martin Luther King Jr. was named after
his dad.
So, is there a Martin Luther King III?
I don't think so.
So, one day on Halloween in 1517, Martin Luther, who was a Catholic priest who had no intentions of breaking the church, nailed a document to the wall of his church. So a couple of things. Martin Luther was Catholic. He was very Catholic. He was a priest. He had been studying the Bible. And he had a couple questions while he was studying the Bible. One of which was, why don't we read it in our own languages?
Why aren't the common people allowed to understand the written word of the Bible? Why did they have to get an intermediary to explain it to them?
Right. And then the other thing is he was reading much of the New Testament, and he was, one of his big things was saved by grace, which is a Paul thing. And he was like, why have we kind of stopped preaching this? Why have we put more emphasis on works? And I kind of want to give you guys context of where Martin Luther is coming from. The Roman Catholic Church in the 1500s was hella corrupt. Like, I can't even overstate how corrupt it was. Was the stream down? Come back, stream. Which isn't...
They basically had the mafia running it for about 100 years.
Yes. So, don't use this... While the modern Roman Catholic Church has problems, it is not nearly the same as what it was like then. One of the big things that Martin Luther was concerned about, that a lot of people were becoming concerned about, was the selling of indulgences. So you guys know that if we sin, which is bound to happen, we do sin. You're supposed to ask forgiveness. God will forgive you. and then you move on, right? Like, there may be some action you should take as part, not so God will forgive you, but so you can, like,
to make it right.
To make it right, right? Like, maybe you stole something, so now you need to give it back. Or maybe you hurt someone, so you need to apologize, right? So in the standard Roman Catholic confession, even today, you go to a priest, you tell him what you did wrong, and he is like, yeah, that was wrong. You need to pray about it, and then depending on what it is, he might be like, and you need to do these steps to make it right. So basically kind of helping you to make it right, right? So you need to apologize to that person, you should donate to this cause, or whatever it is, right? So during this time period with the selling of indulgences, they kind of took it to a next level. They said, hey guys, particularly nobles and wealthy merchants, you could pay us in advance for your sins. We could like pre-forgive you. So if you're going to like murder that dude or commit adultery or, whatever, just let us know in advance. And we'll basically give you a free ticket to cover your sin. Yay!
And the Catholic Church denied that they did that for hundreds of years until recently when they actually came out and be like, yeah, we did that, and Martin Luther was right to criticize it.
Yeah.
Like recently, within my lifetime, they finally owned up to it and admitted that they were actually doing it. Yeah. They paid for St. Peter's Basilica that way. That's how much money they raised from it. It was like the most monumental architecture the Western world had ever seen, and they funded it through indulgences.
Right. So it's not just that you asked for forgiveness and then they asked you to pay money after you asked for forgiveness. It was that they had you pay them before you even committed the sin.
And that way you wouldn't have to worry about falling out of a state of grace, because that's how the Catholic Church works. If you die and you haven't had last rites, or a Catholic Church for a Catholic priest forgive you of your sins, then you're going to be punished in the afterlife. You might have to spend extra time in purgatory before going to heaven. This way, you could go ahead and get pre-cleared for your sin, and if you died in commission of it, you wouldn't have anything to worry about.
That's what they told themselves. And priests like Martin Luther, he was certainly not the only one, were a little disgruntled by this. They looked at the Bible and they said, this is wrong. Like, what is this? So Martin Luther was only intending to fix the Catholic Church. He didn't want to start something. He was just like, hey guys, we're wrong.
He was trying to have an internal dialogue and reform from within.
Yes. He was like, we need to do these things to get us back on track. And so he made 95 points. That's the 95 Theses. And he was like, if these are things I'm concerned about, either actions we're doing, like the selling of indulgences, or the theological things that I think we've gotten wrapped around that we shouldn't be wrapped around. And maybe we've overestimated these other things, right? Like, so he wrote this whole thing. He nailed it on the door of his church, really for the other priests in his church to read. And because of this, he basically got excommunicated. Excommunicated is when you get kicked out of the church, generally the Roman Catholic Church. I think other groups could excommunicate you if they wanted to, but generally it's something associated with the Roman Catholic Church. So Martin Luther then basically accidentally creates his own denomination, because he's like, you can't kick me out of the church. How dare you?
Because he was German and he was willing to translate the Bible into German, there were a lot of German princes who were very powerful who were willing to support him because they wanted that knowledge and didn't like the control that the Catholic Church had over them.
Because once again, it comes back to power.
Because the nobles, for a variety of reasons, they wanted to know what their actual religion was so that they could argue in their own defense. And they really didn't like there being a church that had more power than them.
Right. So something you have to remember is that the Pope had more power than any king. Every Christian king answered to the Pope.
Sort of.
They fought over it.
Yeah. Excommunicating a king or a queen, which happened a few times as well, meant that any other European monarchy could declare war on that particular person, on that monarch, and seize their land, and everyone else would go along with it. Like the word that you use for that is called a casus belli. It's a valid reason to go to war, and all of the Europeans loved going to war over other people's land and stuff, and were always looking for valid reasons. The Pope could give the warlords valid reasons. And so that was the thing that the Pope had so much power with, is if you got excommunicated, your allies stopped being your allies and wanted to take your stuff.
Facts. So, Lutheranism became very popular in Germany. Martin Luther was German. The German princes supported it, though it is important to remember that at this time there is no unified Germany. It's a bunch of separate German princes.
The Holy Roman Empire at that point.
Yeah, was part of it.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's how we get Lutherans. They came from Martin Luther and the 95 Theses, but that is not the only Protestant group. And we're going to kind of walk through different things. But the Anglican Church, a.k.a. the Church of England, a.k.a. in America, the Episcopal Church. So how did that come about? That was also during the Protestant Reformation. Basically, all this Martin Luther business was going on, right? And Henry VIII was King of England, and he was married to his wife, Catherine of Aragon, for a very long time.
A Spanish princess. Her brother was the King of Spain.
And her cousin, I believe, was the Pope.
Yeah, at the time. I think that's probably true.
And they had a daughter, Mary, but Henry VIII wanted a son, because daughters were not worth as much, and certainly not for kings. Nobody wants to leave their kingdom to a queen. That leaves things
It ends the dynasty in many ways.
Yes, because the queen would marry a man. Generally, that's how that works. To continue the bloodline, and it would generally become the man's dynasty after that. So he really wanted a son, but he had been married to Catherine for a very long time, I believe. Like 20 years, I want to say, or something like that. And all they had was a daughter. So he wanted to annul his marriage, which is a little bit different from divorce. Annulment says that this marriage was never legitimate in the first place. Usually, like today, if you marry someone and then within 24 hours or some short period of time learn something about them that's horrific, you can annul your marriage and be like, I take it back. And it's not a divorce. It's like, it never happened.
Or they were actually married at the time that
Yes.
you married them. The marriage gets annulled.
Right.
Annulment is like saying it never happened.
Yes. It's erasing its existence. So he was trying to erase this marriage that had existed for a very long time, and he had a daughter by.
That daughter was, the niece of the emperor,
King of Spain.
The Emperor of Spain. And so the Emperor of Spain, who was also very powerful, wanted his niece to be on the throne, and she was going to inherit.
Yes. So Henry VIII went to the Pope, and he asked for this annulment. And the Pope said, no, I'm not annulling your marriage to your wife.
Yeah, the Pope said, I do whatever the Emperor of Spain says, and he says no, so you can't.
Yeah. And so Henry VIII was like, that's not cool, man. I want a son. Plus, I am totally having an affair with this other woman, and I want to marry her. And Anne Boleyn was her name. And so he's like, well, the Germans started their own church. I'm going to start my own church. And guess who's going to be the head of it? Not the Pope. Me. King of England, head of the church. So he created his own church for power. Now, this isn't to say there aren't theological differences between Anglicanism and Catholicism, because I think the Archbishop of England was like,
Yeah, so there was a lot of internal support for it for both theological reasons. A lot of the lower level people who ran the church in England for the Catholics didn't like having to answer to the Pope, who was so far away. Henry VIII himself was frustrated by the fact that The money he raised from his own lands in England was less than what the Catholic Church raised from their lands in England. He was getting like £100,000 a year, which is, a huge amount of money from the crown lands in England at the time. But the Catholic Church owned land and was getting more money from it than he was. And a lot of the nobles agreed with that. They didn't like that fact. They thought that they were the ones that should own the land, not the church.
Yeah. So England became, quote unquote, Protestant. It is Protestant. And though it was not set. Henry VIII, when he died, he did end up having a son by his third wife. He had 6 wives. If you ever need to remember what happened to them, it's always divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Anne Boleyn got beheaded after she was the mother of Elizabeth. The third wife gave him Edward the Sixth. There's a V in it. I don't know if it's 4th, 5th, 6th. Anyway,
6th.
Edward the Sixth. What happened is after Henry died, Edward the Sixth became king, but he was a child. And he was very sickly, and he actually died as a kid while he was king. So then what happens? So the way the English dynasty worked until the past 10 years was that any son, no matter their age, became king after their father died.
Yeah, the eldest son became king. The eldest surviving son. And if there were no sons, then it went to the eldest daughters.
Right. So Mary became queen. She is what is known, her name in history is Bloody Mary, because she was Catholic, because once again she was Spanish. After the divorce, I think she went to live in Spain with her mother. And so she came back and she basically tried to convert England back to Catholicism by the sword. It didn't go so well. But then she died without an heir. So her sister became queen after her. So that's Elizabeth I, not the current Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth I. And she brought England back to Protestantism and actually a golden age. That's the time of Shakespeare, the Spanish Armada, a lot of stuff that went on.
Colonizing the New World.
Yeah. Elizabeth I is remembered very fondly and as a great queen. So from there on out, England was still mostly Protestant, except there was some stuff with James and Charles later.
Yeah. And that has to do with Scotland and Scottish nationality.
Which actually segues us into our next denomination, which is our own. Yay. So Reformed theology. That is what Presbyterianism is under, this Reformed theology, which is different from Lutheranism and Anglicanism. It came about around the same time because of a guy named John Calvin. He was actually French, I believe, though with a name like John Calvin, that seems odd. Let me see. I have his Wikipedia up. I'm pretty sure. Oh, yes, he was born Johann Calvin. Or something like that. I'm not French. So he was a French theologian around the same time as Martin Luther, and he was looking at things a little bit differently. And whereas in Lutheranism, what Martin Luther really got caught up on and stuck on was saved by grace. You don't have to do things to be saved. You just have to trust God. What John Calvin got stuck on was Paul's occasional use of the word the elect or the chosen. And he was like, aha, that means none of it matters. God chose who got saved. And that is predestination, Calvinism. There's a lot more in that. There's the tulip of Calvinism, which is...
it's the 5 points. Is that what it is?
Total depravity, unlimited... oh my gosh. Not unlimited.
Limited atonement.
That's the L. L is limited atonement. I is irresistible grace. And P is perseverance of the saints. But now I forgot what the T stands for. Wait, does someone in the chat know? It was John Calvin's chair. It was very uncomfortable. Let's see. Calvinism, tulip.
Unconditional election.
Unconditional election. So what that means is total depravity is the idea that without God, nothing you ever do will ever be good. Ever.
Which is true for a very bizarre definition of the word good.
If you can't tell, I'm not a Calvinist, so we're going with this. Sorry, the U I always forget. Unconditional election means nothing you did is what got you chosen. God chose you, and now you're chosen.
And you can't unchoose yourself.
You can't unchoose yourself. Limited atonement means Jesus didn't die for everybody. He died for, like, just the chosen. Irresistible grace means if you are chosen, you have no ability to not be chosen. It is irresistible. You can't resist it. Resistance is futile. God is the Borg, I guess. P is perseverance of the saints, which is once saved, always saved. That I agree with. But the rest of the stuff I have problems with. So that was kind of his thing, was that everything's kind of predestined and futile, and weirdly that didn't make him be like, so why bother? But it didn't really catch on. It didn't catch on during this time period. People were like, okay, John.
Mm-hmm. These ideas seem kind of crazy.
They're weird. Whatever. But what happened is the Scottish eventually got hold of these ideas. So when the Anglican Church came to England, or England became Anglican, it didn't come to England, the Scots did not go for it. If you know anything about the Scottish and the English, it's that they hate each other, particularly during this time period. Even a little bit today. And they live on the same island, and they're not very happy about it. So if the English are going to do it, the Scottish are not. And so they were like, no, we stand by the one true church. We are Catholic. And there were many wars. If you have watched Outlander, which I don't recommend, it's very rated R. Some of those wars are described in it. It's the Jacobite rebellion. They were the Catholics. But eventually, Catholicism began to fall out of favor in Scotland. But they didn't want to be Anglican. They didn't want to be under the Church of England. They didn't want the head of England to be the head of their church. So this idea of this reformed belief, Presbyterianism, kind of got a foothold in Scotland. Presbyter is actually, my understanding, a Scottish word, and it means elder. Our church is ruled by a council of elders. And so the Scottish kind of took these extreme beliefs of John Calvin and softened them a little bit for the Presbyterian church. The Presbyterian church is not as extreme as John Calvin. That is where Calvinism really got its first, Calvinism, but Presbyterianism got its first foothold. From there, it spread to America and other places. So once again, we're seeing that all of these denominations, while they had theological grounds, power is kind of behind it, right? Martin Luther didn't want to start a new denomination, but the German princes were very fond of that idea.
The idea of starting a denomination was foreign to him. He wouldn't have even have considered that something that one could do.
Yes. But with the backing of the German princes, that is what he did. Yeah. Henry VIII wanted the power. He started a new denomination. The Scottish weren't looking for power. They were looking to not be under the power of the Anglican Church.
And they wanted to get free of the Catholics because the Catholics had
used and abused them
basically just to start trouble with the English.
Yeah.
The Jacobite rebellion was supported by, and I say supported, by some of the other European powers, and they never really delivered on it. They just wanted the Scots to be annoying to the English so that they could maybe steal some of the colonial possessions that England owned.
Yeah.
And they got betrayed. The help that was promised to fight the English never materialized.
Yeah. So we have these three denominations, which power was definitely at play in it. And then we get the Methodists. They're different. Power was not actually part of it. Methodism was kind of a denomination started by college students. This is true. This is true. So we have John Wesley and the Great Awakening. So Methodism is a very English American thing, though it has spread through the world. It's everywhere now. And basically what happened is there was a revival at a college in England, and some young English fellows were like, we need to take things back to our basics. We need to, spread the word of God. And Methodism is not super theologically different from a lot of other English or American denominations. But what it did was kind of started the evangelical movement, if you will. This idea that we're not... See, it's hard to talk about Methodism without talking about the Enlightenment. So Lutheranism, Anglican, Reformed thoughts, these all came out of the Protestant Reformation, which is kind of a it's kind of part of the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance started in the 1300s. And then basically what happened is the printing press was invented in the 1500s. Reading and writing became available to almost everybody. And so with that knowledge, with those, the democratization of thought, people were able to have different ideas. But we see despite that these denominations were kind of still started by people in power, because the common people were not used to the idea of being able to read and think for themselves. That was new. That was a new idea. And so they still needed leaders to take them, right? So from 1500 onward, reading became more and more and more part of the Western world. We've talked about before that the Romans were actually really pro-literacy. There was a lot of reading programs. A lot of people could read in Latin in the Roman Empire, but writing and having materials available for people to read was very hard, right? Whereas with the invention of the printing press, now suddenly anyone can make a pamphlet. Anyone can make a newspaper.
And books got cheap.
It used to be to make a book, scribes are sitting there writing it out, right? So the Enlightenment happens in the 1700s. This is a very French thing that spread across the world, which is... It's hard to describe in terms that everyone's gonna unfollow, but it was very humanitarian, which is that they were kind of thinking about it, and they were like, maybe all this theology stuff that we've been told and spoon-fed by the churches for the past 200 years, maybe theology only exists to oppress people and for people in power. And to be fair, looking at the history, you can see how they got that. That was certainly not the only part of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was very philosophical. There were a lot of debates. But one of the big things that came out of the Enlightenment in that time period was this move towards science, rationalism, logic. Like it's a step away from mysticism. Before the Enlightenment, people very much believed in the mystical, right? I could step through a cloud and because of that have bad humors. Like they didn't understand how diseases spread. They thought it was like I could catch this demon, right? Or anything like that. So the Enlightenment really was this scientific, rational thought. And then for the first time, this kind of thought came like, maybe we should be nice to each other, not because God told us to be nice to each other, but because it's the right thing to do. Which is where humanitarianism comes from, right? This idea that humans, that we owe each other something, and we don't need a deity to tell us we owe each other something. Humanitarianism gets a bad name in Christian circles, but I actually think this is an important step and process in human development, right? God had to tell us how to do something when we were primitive screwheads. But now we're finally reaching the point as people that it's like, we're finally understanding what Jesus said when he said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Maybe I should be nice to Trevor because he's a human. What?
And your husband.
Mind-blowing, right? So Methodism, the Great Awakening, there was kind of this move towards rationalism, and the church was a little bit afraid of it. They didn't know how to but But weirdly, the opposite happened, right? They were afraid it was going to pull people away from the church. But what happened is you had these college students studying all these things, and they managed to take these Enlightenment ideals and apply them to their religion and their faith. And from that, we get Methodism. You don't get Baptists from this. The Baptist history is very weird, but it re-energized the Baptist church in America, particularly. So the evangelical movement comes out of the Great Awakening, which is a direct reaction to the Enlightenment, but it's not a denial of the Enlightenment. It's the Enlightenment informing faith and being applied to a world where faith is still applicable. So that is where the evangelical movement kind of started. Is with the Great Awakening and John Wesley. Methodists and Baptists got caught up in that. Presbyterians got caught up into that as well. And so that's why Presbyterians are now kind of in the scale of things considered more on the evangelical side. But Presbyterians kind of straddle that. So all of this is today's lesson. This is kind of the history. The Enlightenment is spelled with an E, Jaron. Enlightenment. And this is a very, very high level overview. You can take entire classes in college just on this. And there's a lot of depth here, and there are theological differences. Like, what is the difference between a Methodist and a Baptist? They're both affected by the Great Awakening. They're both energized by the Great Awakening. But what do they believe that is actually different? That is what we're going to look at next week. So this week we kind of looked at the history, how history and power created these denominations. But next week we're going to look at how there are actual theological differences between them, what those theological differences mean, does it matter, and what do we all believe? What holds us all together? How are we all able to stay under this umbrella of Christians when we became denominations for different reasons? We have different beliefs. Those are the things we're going to look at next week. So I hope you found this history lesson enjoyable. Not a lot of Bible today, but I still think it's important for us to understand this and understand our context of where we come from. Because history is important. History influences everything, right? The world is dominoes. Not the pizza, the game, right? And you might not understand why something today is happening. And it's happening sometimes because of things that were put in play 50, 60, 100, 200 years ago, right? Which is kind of how these denominations came into play, right? Martin Luther was the last domino that started the Protestant Reformation. But there were things put in place earlier that led to this, right? And Martin Luther was also the first domino that led to all these Protestant groups just like spreading everywhere and feeling like they had the ability to say, no, I think you're wrong. And that is why we have 1,000 denominations today, because we are Americans and we feel very strongly about being able to look at each other and say, no, I think you're wrong. That might be the thing that binds us together as Americans. So that's today's lesson. Are there any prayer requests? Please put your prayer requests. Yeah, that's next week's lesson. Prayer requests in the chat. And if you ever have any historical questions, Google is your friend, but you can also ask us. Trevor and I like history. So let me stop the recording.